Hello and welcome to our channel. Tonight, we leave the solid ground of documented fact and set sail on a sea of rumor, whispers, and shadows. We journey back to the midpoint of the 20th century, to a time when the world was engulfed in war, and science was being pushed to its absolute limits and perhaps beyond. It was an era of unprecedented desperation and innovation, where the line between the possible and the impossible seemed to blur with each passing day. Our story tonight is a ghost story wrapped in a government conspiracy. It's a tale of a phantom ship, of brilliant minds like Albert Einstein, and of a top-secret military experiment so terrifying, so profoundly reality-bending, that its true nature has been officially denied for over 80 years. It is perhaps the single greatest military mystery of World War II. A story that has haunted the fringes of history, refusing to die, whispered in hushed tones by sailors and conspiracy theorists alike. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment. Picture the scene. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in the late summer or early fall of 1943. The air is thick with the smell of salt, steel, and coal smoke. The shipyard is a hive of activity, a critical artery in America's war effort. Ships are being built, repaired, and outfitted at a frantic pace. The Battle of the Atlantic is raging, and German U-boats, the wolf packs, are hunting Allied shipping with devastating success. Every vessel lost is a blow to the war effort, a loss of precious lives and vital supplies. The U.S. Navy is desperate for a technological edge, any advantage that could turn the tide against this underwater menace. And so, moored at a pier, sits a newly commissioned destroyer escort, 173. A sleek gray predator of a ship. Its name is the USS Eldridge. According to the legend, the Eldridge is about to become the subject of a revolutionary experiment, an attempt to apply a radical scientific theory to the practical art of warfare. The goal? To make the ship invisible. Not just camouflaged, not hidden behind a smokescreen, but electromagnetically invisible to enemy radar and, more importantly, to the magnetic torpedoes used by German U-boats. The scientific principle behind this was supposedly Albert Einstein's unified field theory, a yet unproven concept that sought to link the forces of electromagnetism and gravity. The theory suggested that, with a powerful enough electromagnetic field, light and even matter itself could be bent and manipulated. The legend tells us that one day the order was given. On board the USS Eldridge, massive generators, specially installed for the experiment, roared to life. A massive amount of electricity was channeled through miles of cabling, wrapped around the ship's hull. Onlookers on the pier and on nearby ships watched in stunned silence. A strange, eerie green fog began to swirl around the Eldridge, crackling with electrical energy. It grew thicker and thicker, obscuring the ship from view. Then, with a brilliant, silent flash of blue-green light, the impossible happened. The USS Eldridge was gone. It hadn't just become invisible. It had completely vanished. It was no longer visible on the water, nor was it detectable on radar. The space where a 1,200-ton warship had been moored just moments before was now empty, showing only the placid, undisturbed waters of the Delaware River. Panic and astonishment gripped the military personnel watching. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, or their worst nightmares. But the story doesn't end there. Because this wasn't just an experiment in invisibility. It was an accidental experiment in teleportation. According to the tale, at the very moment the Eldridge vanished from the Philadelphia shipyard, it spontaneously reappeared hundreds of miles away, at the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. For several minutes, sailors in Norfolk stared in disbelief at the ghost ship, surrounded by its strange green fog, before it vanished as suddenly as it had arrived. And then it reappeared back at its mooring in Philadelphia. The experiment was over. But the true horror was only just beginning. When the green fog finally dissipated and naval personnel were able to board the ship, they discovered a scene of unimaginable terror. The crew was in a catastrophic state. Some sailors were violently ill. Others were driven permanently insane, their minds shattered by the experience. Most disturbingly, some members of the crew were found fused into the very structure of the ship. Men were embedded in the steel bulkheads and deck plates. Their bodies and the ship's metal merged at a molecular level, living and dead alike trapped in an eternal metallic embrace. Others were simply gone, vanished from our plane of existence forever. And some, the survivors said, were caught in a terrible state of flux, fading in and out of visibility, sometimes disappearing for minutes or hours at a time, only to reappear screaming. The Navy, horrified by the results, immediately classified the entire project at the highest level of secrecy. The surviving crew were discharged as mentally unfit or sworn to an unbreakable oath of silence. The official records were scrubbed, and the Philadelphia experiment was buried, becoming nothing more than a ghost story. Is this what really happened? Did the U.S. Navy tear a hole in the fabric of space-time in 1943? Or is the Philadelphia experiment the ultimate urban legend, a masterpiece of modern folklore? Tonight, we will pull on the threads of this incredible story. We will trace it back to its bizarre origins, examine the evidence that has kept it alive, and uncover the far more mundane, yet still fascinating truth that may lie at its core. This is a journey into one of the most enduring military mysteries of all time. So settle in, and let's investigate the case of the vanishing warship. Our investigation begins not in 1943, but a dozen years later in 1955. It begins with a man named Morris K. Jessup. Jessup was not a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. He was an astronomer, an archaeologist, and a serious-minded author. He had a master's degree in astronomy from the University of Michigan and had once headed the largest refracting telescope in the Southern Hemisphere. In the mid-1950s, he had become fascinated with the growing phenomenon of unidentified flying objects. He wrote a book titled The Case for the UFO, which was a sober scientific-minded inquiry into the subject. Jessup argued that UFOs were a real phenomenon that deserved serious study, and that they likely operated on some form of anti-gravity technology, unknown to mainstream science. In 1956, Jessup received a letter. It was written in a strange, rambling style, with erratic capitalization and punctuation, using a mix of different colored inks. The letter was from a man who signed his name, Carlos Miguel Allende. Allende claimed to have read Jessup's book and praised his courage for tackling such a controversial subject. But then he began to hint at something far stranger. He claimed that he had witnessed one of Jessup's UFOs being created by the U.S. Navy. He wrote about an experiment he had witnessed from his post on a merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, in 1943. He described seeing a destroyer become invisible and then reappear, surrounded by a green glow. He mentioned Einstein's unified field theory and spoke of the horrific effects on the crew. Jessup, though intrigued, was a busy man. He wrote back to Allende, asking for more concrete details and evidence. He received no reply. He largely dismissed the letter as the work of a crank and moved on. But the story didn't end there. A year later, in the spring of 1957, Jessup was contacted by the U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Research, the ONR, in Washington, D.C. They had received a strange package. It was a copy of Jessup's own book, The Case for the UFO. Someone had mailed it to them anonymously. The strange part was that the book was filled with handwritten annotations in the margins, made by 3 different individuals, seemingly in conversation with each other. The notes were written in the same rambling style as the Allende letter, using multiple colors of ink. These annotations expanded on the story of the Philadelphia experiment in great detail. They discussed magnetic sinks and energy fields. They claimed that Einstein himself had been involved but had backed out due to moral concerns. They spoke of the crew, referring to them as frozen in time or stuck. They described men bursting into flames, a phenomenon they called a great deal of heat. The notes were a bizarre mix of pseudoscientific jargon, cryptic references, and what seemed to be insider knowledge of a highly classified project. The handwriting appeared to belong to someone who was either a genius, a madman, or both. The officers at the ONR were perplexed. The notes were bizarre, but they were also detailed and strangely compelling. Two officers, Commander George W. Hoover and Captain Sidney Sherby, took a particular interest. They invited Jessup to Washington to examine the book. Jessup immediately recognized the handwriting and the peculiar style. It was the same as the Carlos Allende letters he had received. Now, instead of this being a single letter from a potential crank, it was a detailed, annotated text that had, for some reason, been sent directly to a high-level naval research office. This gave the story a veneer of official significance. The ONR was so intrigued by the document that they took a highly unusual step. They paid a private company in Texas, the Vero Manufacturing Company, to print a small, limited run of Jessup's book, complete with all of Allende's bizarre annotations. Around 127 copies of this Vero edition were produced and circulated internally within the Navy. This single act is the cornerstone of the Philadelphia experiment conspiracy. Why would the U.S. Navy go to the trouble and expense of reprinting and distributing the ramblings of a supposed madman? To believers, the answer is obvious. Because Allende's story was true, the Navy knew the experiment had happened, and they were trying to understand the strange science he described. The Vero edition became the holy grail of the legend, a semi-official document that seemed to prove the government's secret interest in the case. For Morris Jessup, however, this strange episode marked the beginning of a downward spiral. His career stalled, his publisher rejected his follow-up books, and he fell into a deep depression. In April 1959, he was found dead in his car in a park in Miami. A hose connected from the exhaust pipe to the interior. His death was officially ruled a suicide. But for believers in the Philadelphia experiment, the timing was too convenient. They claimed Jessup had gotten too close to the truth and had been silenced by the same shadowy forces that had covered up the experiment in the first place. His death added a layer of tragic martyrdom to the growing urban legend. For 2 decades, the story of the Philadelphia experiment remained in the realm of obscure UFO literature and paranormal folklore, known only to a small community of enthusiasts. But that all changed in 1979 with the publication of a book that would cement the legend in the public consciousness. The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, co-authored by Charles Berlitz. Berlitz was already a household name in the world of paranormal nonfiction. He was the author of the multi-million-copy bestseller, The Bermuda Triangle. He had a knack for taking mysterious events and weaving them into compelling, page-turning narratives that blurred the line between fact and speculation. With the Philadelphia Experiment, he and his co-author William L. Moore took the raw material of the Allende letters and the Vero edition and built a complete cinematic story around it. Their book added new layers and specific details to the legend. They gave the experiment a specific date, October 28, 1943. They claimed there were 2 experiments, a partially successful one in July, and the disastrous final one in October. They interviewed new, often anonymous, witnesses who claimed to have knowledge of the event. They fleshed out the role of figures like Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein, presenting a coherent, if highly speculative, narrative. The Berlitz book was a massive success. It took the Philadelphia experiment out of the fringe and into the mainstream. It was no longer just a weird story. It was a full-blown military mystery, a piece of popular culture. The book's success led, inevitably, to a movie. In 1984, The Philadelphia Experiment was released. The film took the core concepts of the legend, the invisible ship, the teleportation, the sailors fused to the deck, and spun a fictional time travel adventure around it, in which 2 sailors from the Eldridge are thrown forward in time to 1984. The movie was a hit and further solidified the story in the minds of a generation. For many, the film became their primary source of information, and its fictional elements became inseparable from the original legend. And this is where the story takes its most fantastical turn, rocketing from a military mystery into the realm of science fiction. In the late 1980s, a man named Alfred Bielek came forward with an astonishing claim. He said he was a survivor of the Philadelphia experiment. Not just a witness but a participant. Bielek's story was a labyrinth of conspiracy and high strangeness. He claimed his real name was Edward Cameron, and that he had been born in 1916. He said that he and his brother Duncan Cameron were scientists working on the project aboard the USS Eldridge. According to Bielek, when the experiment went wrong on October 28, 1943, he and his brother, fearing for their lives, jumped overboard into the swirling green energy field. But they didn't land in the waters of the Delaware River. Instead, they were hurled through a wormhole and landed 40 years in the future, in the year 1983, at a secret military base at Montauk Point, Long Island. This introduced a whole new conspiracy into the mix. The Montauk Project, a supposed continuation of the Philadelphia experiment that dealt with psychological warfare, time travel, and contact with extraterrestrial beings. Bielek claimed that, in 1983, he was met by Dr. John von Neumann, the famous mathematician who had supposedly been a key figure in the original experiment, and who, in reality, had died in 1957. He was then sent back in time, his memory was wiped and altered, and he was placed into a new family, the Bielek family, to live out a normal life unaware of his true past. It was only in the late 1980s, after watching the movie The Philadelphia Experiment, that his memories began to flood back. Al Bielek became a star on the paranormal lecture circuit. His story was incredibly detailed and compellingly told. He spoke with an air of authority and sincerity that many found convincing. He connected the Philadelphia experiment to everything from the Montauk Project to the Roswell UFO crash and secret alien treaties. He spun a grand unified conspiracy theory that was irresistible to many. For a new generation of believers, Al Bielek was the living proof. The smoking gun that proved the entire sprawling saga was true. So here we have it. A story that begins with a set of strange letters, is given legitimacy by the Navy's own curiosity, popularized by a best-selling author and a Hollywood movie, and finally given a living witness in the form of a supposed time-traveling survivor. It's an incredible tale. But is any of it true? This is where we must turn from the legend to the investigation. And when we do, a very different picture of the USS Eldridge begins to emerge. Let's start with the official story. The U.S. Navy has been unequivocal and consistent for decades. The Philadelphia experiment, as described in the legends, never happened. They state flatly that there is no record of any experiment involving invisibility or teleportation, and that such claims belong to the realm of science fiction. They dismiss the entire story as a hoax. Of course, a conspiracy theorist would say, well, of course they deny it. But in this case, the Navy has something more powerful than denials. Ship's logs. The movements of every commissioned naval vessel are meticulously recorded. And the ship's log for the USS Eldridge tells a very clear and very mundane story. According to the official records, the USS Eldridge Do-173 was built at the Newark shipyard. It was launched on July 25, 1943, and formally commissioned into the Navy on August 27, 1943. From August through September, it was in New York and the Long Island Sound, undergoing its shakedown cruises, the standard sea trials for any new ship. Now for the key dates. The legend places the final disastrous experiment in Philadelphia on October 28, 1943. Where was the real USS Eldridge on that day? According to its complete war diary and deck log, which have been declassified and are available to the public at the National Archives, the Eldridge was nowhere near Philadelphia. In October 1943, it was on its first tour of duty, making its way to the Caribbean. The logs show it leaving New York, sailing to Bermuda, and spending the latter part of the month in the Bahamas on escort duty. On October 28, the ship was at sea far to the south. The official records, the primary source documents from the time, make it physically impossible for the Eldridge to have been in Philadelphia for the alleged experiment. So where did the story come from? How did the USS Eldridge get attached to this legend? And what about the core elements of the story: the green glow, the teleportation, the sick and vanishing sailors? Skeptics and researchers believe they have found plausible, real-world explanations for every single piece of the myth. Let's address the most dramatic claim: the teleportation. The story goes that the Eldridge vanished from Philadelphia and was seen minutes later in Norfolk, Virginia. An impossible journey of over 200 nautical miles. But was it impossible? While traveling that distance in the open Atlantic Ocean would indeed take many hours, there is another route. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal is a 14-mile-long waterway that connects the Delaware River to the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay. From there, a ship can travel down the protected waters of the bay directly to Norfolk. This internal waterway route is significantly shorter and faster than the open ocean route. A modern destroyer could make that trip in about 6 hours. While still not instantaneous, a ship leaving Philadelphia in the morning could very well be seen in Norfolk by the late afternoon. This is where the witness, Carlos Allende, comes back in. He claimed to have seen the Eldridge from his merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. Records show that the Andrew Furuseth was indeed part of a convoy that traveled from Norfolk to the Mediterranean in October 1943. It's plausible that sailors on the Andrew Furuseth, while docked in Norfolk, saw the USS Eldridge arrive. If they had just come from Philadelphia via the slower, open ocean route, and they saw the Eldridge arrive impossibly fast, not knowing it had taken the canal shortcut, a tall tale could easily be born. How did that destroyer get here so fast? It's like it teleported. This is the kind of sailor's yarn that gets spun over drinks at a portside bar. Now for the central element of the story: the attempt to make the ship invisible. This is widely believed to be a fantastic misinterpretation of a very real, and at the time highly secret, naval procedure known as degaussing. During World War II, one of the biggest threats to Allied ships was the magnetic mine or torpedo. These weapons didn't need to physically hit a ship. They were designed to detonate when they detected the large magnetic field that a massive steel hull naturally produces. The Navy's countermeasure was degaussing. This process involved wrapping a ship in large electrical cables and passing a powerful electric current through them. This created an opposing magnetic field that effectively canceled out the ship's own magnetic signature, making it invisible to magnetic mines. Imagine you are a merchant sailor in 1943, like Carlos Allende. You see a new destroyer being wrapped in massive black cables. You see powerful generators being brought aboard. Then, at night, you see them throw the switch. A massive electrical charge surges through the cables. This could easily create a visible phenomenon, a strange electrical corona, a crackling sound, and a bizarre, ionized greenish-blue glow in the air around the ship, especially in humid conditions. To an outside observer who didn't know the purpose of degaussing, it would look like something out of a science fiction story. It would look exactly like the eerie green fog described in the legend. The degaussing procedure didn't make the ship physically invisible, but it did make it magnetically invisible, and the process itself looked incredibly strange. This is almost certainly the seed of truth from which the entire urban legend grew. What about the horrific effects on the crew? The men fused to the deck, the sailors driven mad? This too has a more prosaic, if still tragic, explanation. Naval ports during wartime were rough and tumble places. Sailors, often young men under immense stress, would go ashore and get into bar fights. Sometimes these fights were brutal. A story about seeing a few sailors from a weird ship getting thrown out of a bar, looking disheveled and perhaps acting erratically, could easily be twisted into a tale of an experiment gone wrong. Those guys from the Eldridge are all crazy. could morph into the experiment drove them crazy. The idea of men being stuck or frozen might have been a slang term for a particularly bad hangover, or perhaps the psychological trauma that we now recognize as PTSD, which was poorly understood at the time. Finally, we must return to the source of it all, the man who called himself Carlos Miguel Allende. Who was he really? Decades after the story broke, researchers finally tracked him down. His real name was Carl Meredith Allen. He was not a mysterious foreign operative, but an American-born man from Pennsylvania. He was a highly intelligent but deeply eccentric and troubled individual. He had served in the merchant marine, so he would have been in the right places to see ships and hear sailors gossip. He had a history of mental health challenges and was known by his family to be a master of confabulation, a person who weaves elaborate fantasies that he himself comes to believe are true. The picture that emerges is not of a malicious hoaxer, but of a brilliant but unstable mind. Carl Allen likely saw a degaussing procedure on a ship. It may or may not have been the Eldridge. He could have easily mixed up the name. He heard sailors telling tall tales in bars. At the same time, he was reading Morris Jessup's book about UFOs and advanced physics. In his mind, these separate threads, the weird green glow of degaussing, the sailors' gossip about a teleporting ship, and Jessup's theories about Einstein's unified field all fused together. He created the Philadelphia experiment in his own mind, a grand fantastical narrative to explain the strange things he thought he had seen. He wrote his bizarre letters to Jessup, and the rest, as they say, is history. So the Philadelphia experiment, the ultimate military mystery, seems to unravel into a collection of misinterpretations, coincidences, and the fantasies of a single troubled man. The teleporting ship was likely a misunderstanding of naval geography. The invisibility field was a misinterpretation of a secret but non-magical technology. The horrific side effects were likely exaggerated sailors' tales. And the star witness Al-Bielek has been thoroughly discredited. Investigators found his birth certificate, proving he was indeed Al-Bielek, born in 1927, not Edward Cameron, born in 1916. His entire story appears to have been a fabrication, built on the foundation of the Berlitz book and the 1984 movie. And yet, the story endures. Why? Why does the legend of the USS Eldridge continue to captivate us, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary? Perhaps it's because it's simply a magnificent story. It has all the elements of a perfect modern myth. A secret government plot, a brilliant but dangerous technology, a link to the enigmatic Albert Einstein, and a tragic human cost. It speaks to our deep-seated belief that the government is hiding powerful secrets from us, and that the world we see is not the only reality. The Philadelphia experiment is a testament to the power of narrative. It shows how a tiny seed of truth, the degaussing procedure on a warship, can be fertilized by imagination, embellished by rumor, and watered by the media until it grows into a sprawling, thorny legend that chokes out the actual facts. It is less a mystery of physics and more a mystery of human psychology, and the birth of a modern urban legend. The true experiment was not on the USS Eldridge, but on the public's imagination, an experiment that continues to this day. Thank you for joining us tonight at Bedtime History. If this deep dive into the legendary Philadelphia experiment and the real story of the USS Eldridge has intrigued you, please show your support by liking this audio, subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the strange and forgotten corners of the past. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think is the most compelling part of this enduring urban legend? Do you believe there's still a kernel of unexplained mystery at its heart? Or is it a classic case of a military mystery solved? Let us know your theories in the comments section below. And if you have another favorite urban legend, unsolved mystery, or bizarre historical event you'd like us to tackle, please share it. We draw our inspiration from your curiosity. Until next time, sleep well and question everything.